The knock came just as Clara Bennett was about to eat the last warm meal in her cabin, and when she opened the door, she saw a frozen little boy in the arms of a stranger who looked close to death. She had almost nothing left for herself, but before that night was over, she would make a choice that would change 3 lives forever. Winter had arrived early in Pine Hollow, Montana. Thick snow covered the mountain road, buried the fences, and turned the pine trees white. The wind moved through the valley like a wild animal, shaking cabin walls and pushing cold air through every small crack. Clara sat beside a weak fire in her tiny home. She was only 23, but hardship had made her feel much older. Her father had died in a logging accident 2 years earlier, and her mother had followed him after a long sickness. The small cabin was the only thing Clara had left. She survived by chopping wood, catching fish, mending clothes for nearby families, and growing a few vegetables during the short summer. She worked from sunrise until dark, but even that was not always enough. That night she slowly stirred a small pot of rabbit stew. It was thin and mostly filled with potatoes and water. On the shelf behind her sat half a loaf of hard bread, a jar of dried beans, and 3 onions. That food had to last until the weather became safe enough for her to travel into town. Clara looked at the pot and quietly counted how many meals she could make from it. Then someone knocked on the door. She stopped moving. No one came this far into the hills during a storm. Her nearest neighbor lived more than 4 miles away, and the road between them had already disappeared beneath the snow. The knock came again, slower and weaker. Clara reached for the old rifle her father had left beside the fireplace. She held it close as she walked toward the door. "Who is it?" she called. For a moment there was only wind. Then a man answered. "Please, ma'am, I have a child with me." Clara lowered the rifle slightly and opened the door. A wall of snow rushed inside. A tall cowboy stood on the porch. His dark coat was covered in ice, and his brown hat was bent from the wind. His face was rough and tired, with a short beard and deep lines around his eyes. But Clara barely looked at him. Her eyes went straight to the small boy in his arms. The child could not have been older than 6. He was wrapped in a thin blanket, but his whole body was shaking. His face was pale, and his eyes were only half open. The cowboy pulled the boy closer to his chest. "My name is Luke Mercer," he said. "This is my son, Toby. Our horse went down on the North Trail. We've been walking for hours." Clara looked past him. The snow was already covering the footprints behind them. "We only need a place until morning," Luke continued. "We can sleep near the door. We won't cause trouble." Toby opened his eyes and looked at Clara. "Please," he whispered. That one word broke through every fear she had. Clara stepped aside. "Bring him in." Luke entered quickly and shut the door behind him. Clara placed the rifle back near the wall and cleared a space beside the fireplace. Luke knelt and carefully set Toby down on a folded rug. The boy moved his hands toward the fire, but his fingers were so cold that he could hardly bend them. Clara found a dry blanket in a wooden chest and wrapped it around his shoulders. Then she filled a cup with warm water and handed it to him. "Drink slowly," she said. Toby obeyed. Luke removed his wet coat and gloves. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was dried blood on one sleeve. Clara noticed it but said nothing. She returned to the pot and took out 3 bowls. Luke watched her. "You don't have to feed us," he said. "The boy needs something warm. I can see you don't have much." Clara looked at him over her shoulder. "I have enough for tonight." She poured the stew into the bowls. She gave Toby the fullest one, Luke the second, and kept the smallest for herself. Luke noticed. He lowered his eyes but did not argue. Toby ate quickly at first. Then Clara gently told him to slow down. Color slowly returned to his cheeks, and the shaking in his hands began to stop. "This is good," he said. Clara smiled. "It would taste better with more meat." Toby shook his head. "It's the best thing I ever ate." Luke looked at his son, then at Clara. Something in his face changed. The hard look in his eyes softened, but sadness remained. After they finished, Clara gave Toby the narrow bed against the wall. Luke stood at once. No, ma'am, he can sleep on the floor with me. He needs rest. And you need your bed. Clara pulled her coat around her shoulders and sat beside the fire. I'll be fine here. Luke stepped closer. You'll be cold. I've been cold before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Toby reached out from the bed. Pa, can we stay here forever? Luke gave a tired smile. No, son, we leave in the morning. Toby looked disappointed, but within minutes his eyes closed. The storm grew worse outside. Wind struck the roof, and snow pushed against the lower half of the door. Luke sat across from Clara near the fire, keeping his voice low so he would not wake the boy. What happened to your arm? Clara asked. Luke looked at the blood on his sleeve. Caught it on a tree when the horse fell. Clara brought a small box of cloth strips and herbs. She cleaned the cut and wrapped it carefully. Luke watched her hands. You help every stranger who knocks on your door. Not many strangers come here. That's not what I asked. Clara tied the cloth and sat back. My mother used to say a person shows who they are when they have little left to give. Luke looked around the cabin. He saw the empty shelves, the patched curtains, the broken chair, and the thin stack of firewood beside the wall. You really do have little left, he said quietly. Clara gave him a small smile. Then I suppose tonight is a good test. Luke lowered his head. He had met people with large homes who would not offer a cup of water. Yet this young woman, who barely had enough to survive the week, had given his son her food, her blanket, and her bed. Long after Clara fell asleep beside the dying fire, Luke remained awake. He watched Toby sleeping safely under the blanket. Then he looked at Clara, curled beneath her old coat with one hand resting near the fireplace. Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver watch. He stared at it for several seconds before closing his fist around it. I won't forget this, he whispered. Before sunrise, Clara woke and added the last thick log to the fire. She warmed what remained of the stew and cut the bread into 3 pieces. Once again, she gave Toby the largest share. The boy smiled as he ate. Luke said little during breakfast. He looked troubled, as though he carried a secret too heavy to speak. When the storm weakened, he put on his coat and helped Toby into his boots. We should go before the wind starts again, he said. Clara walked them to the door. Toby suddenly wrapped his arms around her waist. Thank you for saving us. Clara knelt and fixed the loose button on his coat. You stay close to your father. I will. Luke placed his hat on his head. I owe you more than I can say. You don't owe me anything. His eyes stayed on hers. That's where you're wrong. Then he took Toby's hand, and they walked into the white forest. Clara watched them until the trees hid them from sight. For the next 3 days, she returned to her lonely work. She carried water, chopped wood, and repaired the roof over her small bedroom. She believed Luke Mercer and his son were already far away. On the 4th morning, a deep sound rolled through the valley. Clara stepped outside. At first, she thought it was thunder. Then she saw horses coming up the mountain road. Behind them came wagon after wagon, all moving toward her cabin. And riding at the front was Luke Mercer. Clara stood frozen on the porch as the line of wagons climbed through the snow toward her cabin. At least 10 riders followed behind them, and several men wore heavy coats marked with the silver badge of Pine Hollow County. The wagons carried barrels, wooden boxes, sacks of grain, lumber, tools, blankets, and enough firewood to last through the winter. Luke Mercer rode at the front on a powerful black horse. His beard had been trimmed, his clothes were clean, and a dark wool coat covered his shoulders. He looked nothing like the tired man who had nearly collapsed at her door 4 nights earlier. Toby sat in the saddle in front of him, waving both hands. Clara, the boy shouted, we came back. Clara slowly stepped into the snow. Her old boots sank almost to her ankles. Luke stopped before the cabin and lifted Toby down. The boy ran straight toward Clara and hugged her tightly. We found our people, he said, and Pa said we had to come get you. Clara looked over Toby's head at Luke. Get me. Luke dismounted and handed the reins to one of the riders. "I should have told you the truth that night," he said. Clara's heart tightened. "What truth?" A broad man with a gray mustache stepped forward. A sheriff's badge shone on his coat. "I'm Sheriff Walter Hayes," he said. "Luke Mercer is known by nearly every rancher between Pine Hollow and Cedar Ridge." Clara looked back at Luke. He removed his hat. "My family owns the Double River Ranch south of Cedar Ridge," he explained. "It is one of the largest cattle ranches in this part of Montana." Clara stared at him in silence. Luke continued before she could speak. 3 weeks ago, a group of men attacked the ranch while most of my workers were moving cattle. They burned the main house, stole part of the herd, and took every horse they could find. Toby moved closer to his father. "Luke took his son and followed the thieves," Sheriff Hayes said. "He found their trail, but a storm caught them in the mountains. The horse they were riding broke its leg. They lost their food and nearly froze." Clara remembered the torn shirt, the blood on Luke's arm, and the fear he had tried to hide. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Luke looked toward her small cabin. "Because a name would not have changed what we were that night. We were two homeless people begging for shelter." He paused. "I also wanted to know whether kindness still existed without money standing behind it." Clara's expression hardened. "So you were testing me?" "No," Luke quickly shook his head. "I swear I was not. I believed we might die before morning. I had nothing to offer you, and I did not know if I would ever recover what had been stolen." Sheriff Hayes stepped closer. "We caught the thieves 2 days ago. Most of Luke's cattle were found in a hidden valley. Several ranchers also brought men and supplies to rebuild his home." Clara looked at the wagons again. "Then why are all these things here?" Luke smiled gently. "Because they belong to you." Clara took a step back. "No." At once, men began unloading sacks of flour, beans, sugar, salt, and dried meat. Others carried blankets, cooking pots, a new stove, and strong wooden boards toward the cabin. Clara lifted both hands. "Stop, please stop." The men paused and looked at Luke. Clara faced him. "I gave you one meal and one place to sleep. I cannot accept all this." "You gave Toby your bed," Luke replied. "You slept beside a dying fire. You shared your last bread with us." "I did what anyone should have done. But no one else did." His words made her silent. Luke reached into his coat and removed the silver watch Clara had seen him holding during the night. "This belonged to my father," he said. "He taught me that a debt of kindness should never be forgotten. I don't want payment. This is not payment." He looked toward Toby. "It is a promise." Toby took Clara's hand. "I told Pa your roof was broken," he said, "and your chair too." Clara gave him a weak smile. "You noticed all that?" "I noticed things." Some of the men laughed softly. Luke turned toward them. "Unload everything." The work began again. Clara tried several more times to stop them, but no one listened. Within an hour, the tiny yard was filled with supplies. 2 carpenters climbed onto the roof and began replacing the weakest boards. Others repaired the fence and brought stacks of dry wood into the shed. A wagon at the end of the line carried a gentle brown milk cow, 6 chickens, and 2 strong horses. Clara covered her mouth. "Luke, this is too much." "It is not enough." Sheriff Hayes opened a leather case and removed a folded paper. "There is something else," he said. Clara looked at the document but did not take it. "What is that?" "A legal land deed." Luke stepped beside her. "The old Miller farm lies across the frozen creek. The owner died last summer without family. I bought the land from the county yesterday." Clara's eyes widened. "Why? I didn't buy it for myself." Sheriff Hayes held out the deed. 25 acres, the farmhouse, the barn, the well, and the lower field now belong to Clara Bennett. Clara stared at the paper as though it might burn her hand. "No, I cannot take someone's farm." "It has been empty for months," Luke said. "The roof is strong, the soil is good, and the barn only needs small repairs." I never asked for land. You never asked for anything. Clara looked at the men working around her cabin. Her chest felt tight and tears filled her eyes. All my life people have taken things from me, she whispered. My parents, our land, my mother's furniture, even the horses my father raised. I don't know how to accept something this large. Luke's voice softened. Then do not think of it as something given to you. Think of it as a place where your hard work can finally grow. Toby pulled at her sleeve. It has a room for me. Luke looked down at him. Toby. The boy's smile disappeared. You said we could visit. We can visit, but it is Clara's home. Clara wiped a tear from her cheek. You would be welcome. Toby's smile returned. The men worked until sunset. By evening, Clara's roof no longer leaked, the chimney had been cleaned, and her shelves were filled with enough food to last for months. Luke and Toby stayed after the others left. Clara cooked a large supper with fresh beef, potatoes, and bread brought in the wagons. For the first time in years, she did not have to count every bite before placing food on the table. Toby talked through the entire meal. He told Clara about the ranch, the stolen cattle, and how Sheriff Hayes had caught the thieves near Redstone Pass. Luke watched them with a quiet smile. After Toby fell asleep near the fire, Clara stepped onto the porch. Moonlight shone over the snow, and the valley looked peaceful again. Luke joined her. You are angry with me, he said. I am confused. That is fair. You came here looking like a man with nothing. I was a man with nothing. You had land, friends, and people searching for you. I did not know that then. The ranch was burned. The herd was gone. My wife died 3 years ago, and Toby was all I had left. Clara looked at him. You thought you had failed him. Luke's jaw tightened. I carried him through that storm and wondered whether he would die because I had made the wrong choice. He survived. Because you opened your door. For a moment, the wind was the only sound between them. Luke reached into his pocket and placed a small brass key in Clara's hand. The farmhouse across the creek is ready whenever you are. Clara closed her fingers around the key. What happens now? Luke looked toward the distant hills. Now you build the life that was taken from you. The next morning, Luke and Toby helped Clara cross the creek to see the property. The farmhouse was larger than her cabin, with 3 bedrooms, a wide porch, and a stone fireplace. The barn stood beside an open field buried beneath snow. Clara walked from room to room in silence. In the kitchen, she found a wooden table beside a bright window. For the first time, she imagined bread cooling on the table, flowers growing outside, and laughter filling the empty rooms. Toby ran upstairs. Clara, come see my room. Luke called after him. It is not your room. Toby leaned over the railing. It could be. Clara laughed, and the sound surprised her. Weeks passed, and Luke continued visiting. He brought workers to repair the barn, but Clara worked beside them every day. She refused to let anyone build her future while she only watched. Toby followed her everywhere. He gathered eggs, carried small pieces of wood, and asked more questions than Clara could answer. One afternoon, while Luke repaired a fence near the lower field, Toby sat beside Clara on the porch. Do you like my paw? He asked. Clara nearly dropped the basket in her hands. Your father is a good man. That is not what I asked. She looked across the field at Luke. He was strong and quiet, but she had begun to see the sadness behind his eyes. He had lost his wife, almost lost his son, and carried every fear alone. Clara looked back at Toby. Yes, she said softly, I like him. Toby smiled. He likes you too. Before Clara could answer, a gunshot echoed from the trees. Luke dropped behind the fence and reached for his rifle. A second shot struck the porch post inches from Clara's head. Toby screamed. Luke looked toward the forest and his face turned cold. Get inside, he shouted. As Clara pulled Toby through the door, 3 armed riders appeared between the pine trees, and the man leading them raised his rifle directly at Luke. The first rifle shot struck the fence beside Luke. He dropped into the snow as the second bullet tore through the porch post near Clara's shoulder. Toby screamed, and Clara pulled him through the farmhouse door before throwing the heavy lock into place. Outside, 3 armed riders came out of the pine trees. The man leading them wore a black coat and a narrow hat. A long scar crossed his left cheek. Luke recognized him at once. "Calvin Rusk," he called. The rider smiled. "I wondered how long it would take you." Calvin Rusk had led the men who attacked Luke's ranch. Sheriff Hayes had captured most of the gang, but Calvin had escaped through the northern hills. Luke crouched behind the fence with his rifle aimed toward the trees. "You should have kept running," he said. Calvin laughed. "You took back the cattle. You helped put my brothers in jail. Now I'm taking the one thing you care about." His eyes moved toward the farmhouse. Luke's face changed. "If you go near that house, you will not leave this valley." Inside, Clara pushed Toby behind the stone fireplace. "Stay low," she whispered. The boy was shaking badly. "Is Pa going to die?" Clara held his face between her hands. "No, your father is strong, and we are going to help him." She opened a wooden cabinet and removed her father's old rifle. Her hands trembled as she loaded it, but her eyes remained fixed on the window. Outside, Luke fired once. One of Calvin's men fell from his saddle and crawled behind a tree. The other rider returned fire, forcing Luke lower behind the fence. Calvin moved toward the barn. Clara watched him through the window. She realized he was trying to circle around Luke and reach the house from the side. She opened the back door quietly. Toby grabbed her dress. "Don't go." "I am not leaving you. I am only moving where I can see him." Clara stepped behind the woodshed and raised the rifle. Snow blew across her face as Calvin moved closer. He did not see her. Luke fired again from the fence. Calvin turned toward the sound and lifted his weapon. Clara aimed at the tree beside him and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the bark inches from Calvin's head. He spun around. Clara stood beside the shed with the rifle against her shoulder. "Take one more step toward that house," she said, "and the next shot will not miss." Calvin stared at her. "You must be the poor little woman Luke rescued." Clara kept the rifle steady. "You have it backward." Luke used the moment to move behind a water trough. Calvin's second man rushed toward the farmhouse, but Luke fired and knocked the rifle from his hands. The man fell into the snow and raised both arms. Calvin turned his horse and raced toward the creek. Luke ran after him, but Calvin reached the narrow bridge first. He looked back, lifted his rifle, and aimed at Clara. Luke saw it. He stepped into the open. Clara downed. The shot rang out. Luke fell. Clara screamed and ran toward him. Calvin disappeared across the creek and into the trees. Luke lay in the snow with blood spreading across the left side of his coat. Clara dropped beside him. "No, stay with me." Luke's eyes opened slowly. "Toby, he is safe." Luke tried to sit up but could not. Clara pressed both hands against the wound. "You are not leaving him," she said. "You hear me? You are not leaving either of us." Toby ran from the farmhouse before Clara could stop him. "Pa." He fell beside Luke and grabbed his hand. Luke looked at his son. "I'm all right." "You're bleeding." "It looks worse than it is." Clara knew he was lying. The bullet had struck below his shoulder. It had passed through, but he had lost too much blood. Clara and Toby dragged him onto an old wooden door and used it like a sled. They pulled him into the farmhouse and placed him near the fire. The captured rider remained outside with his hands tied to the fence. The wounded man had escaped into the trees. Clara cleaned Luke's wound with hot water and whiskey. He never cried out, but sweat covered his face. "You learned this from your mother?" he asked weakly. "My father was injured many times." Luke looked toward Toby. "Calvin will come back. Then Sheriff Hayes will be waiting." "How will the sheriff know?" Clara looked at Toby. "The bell." A large iron bell stood beside the barn. Farmers in the valley used it to warn each other about fire, storms, or danger. Toby understood. "I can ring it." Clara shook her head. "It is too dangerous. I can go through the cellar and come out behind the barn." Luke tried to speak, but pain stopped him. Clara looked at the boy. He was afraid, but there was courage in his eyes. "You ring it and come straight back," she said. "Do not leave the barn." Toby nodded. He crawled through the small cellar door and disappeared beneath the house. A few moments later, the bell began to ring. Its deep sound rolled across the frozen valley. Once, twice, again and again. Far away, dogs began barking. Then another warning bell answered from a neighboring farm. Calvin had not expected that. Within 20 minutes, riders appeared on the southern road. Sheriff Hayes led them with several armed ranchers behind him. Calvin tried to escape through a narrow ravine, but fresh snow had blocked the trail. Sheriff Hayes found him before sunset and brought him back in chains. By then, the farmhouse was filled with neighbors. An old doctor named Henry Walsh removed pieces of cloth from Luke's wound and stitched the torn skin. Clara stood nearby, her hands still covered in his blood. "Will he live?" she asked. Dr. Walsh looked at her. "The bullet missed his heart and lung. He needs rest, warmth, and someone stubborn enough to make him listen." Toby pointed toward Clara. "She is stubborn." For the first time since the shooting, Clara laughed through her tears. Luke remained weak for several weeks. Snow covered the valley and Clara cared for him every day. She changed the bandages, brought him soup, and refused to let him leave the bed before the doctor allowed it. Toby stayed with them and filled the farmhouse with noise. He carried wood, fed the chickens, and sat beside his father each evening. One night, Luke woke and saw Clara sleeping in the chair beside him. Her head rested against the wall, and one hand still held the cloth she had used to cool his fever. He remembered the first night in her cabin. She had opened her door when he had nothing. Now she had risked her life to protect his son and had saved him again. By early spring, Luke could walk outside without help. The snow began to melt and the lower field turned green. Clara planted seeds near the porch, while Toby carried water in a small bucket. Luke leaned against the fence and watched them. For years, he had believed his life would always feel empty after his wife died. He had cared for Toby, managed the ranch, and kept moving, but he had forgotten what it felt like to hope for something more. That evening, he asked Clara to walk with him to the creek. The setting sun turned the water gold. Luke stopped beneath a cottonwood tree. "I planned to give you land and supplies because I wanted to repay you," he said. Clara smiled. "You already gave too much." "No, I was wrong." She looked at him. "About what?" "I thought kindness was a debt, something a man could return with money, horses, or land." He stepped closer. "But what you gave us cannot be repaid." Clara's eyes filled with tears. Luke took her hands. "You did not only save Toby from the storm, you gave him a home in his heart. You gave me a reason to believe our family did not have to remain broken." Clara looked toward the farmhouse, where Toby stood watching from the porch. Luke lowered himself onto one knee. "Clara Bennett, would you let me spend the rest of my life trying to give you the same love you gave us that first night?" Clara covered her mouth. Toby could no longer stay quiet. "Say yes." Clara laughed and cried at the same time. "Yes," she whispered, "I will." Luke stood and held her close. Toby ran across the field and wrapped his arms around them both. That summer, Clara and Luke were married in the small white church at Cedar Falls. The building was filled with ranchers, merchants, farmers, and families from across the valley. Sheriff Hayes stood beside Luke. Toby carried the rings and proudly told everyone that Clara had saved his father twice. After the ceremony, Luke moved part of his cattle to Clara's land. Together, they expanded the barn, planted wheat, and built a larger home beside the creek. Clara never forgot the lonely cabin in the mountains. She kept it standing and filled it with firewood, blankets, and food for travelers caught in winter storms. Years later, people still told the story of the poor girl who opened her door to a homeless cowboy and his son. They spoke about the wagons, the land, the gunfight, and the wedding. But Clara always said the greatest surprise was much simpler. On the coldest night of her life, she believed she was giving away the little she had left. Instead, she was opening the door to the family she had been waiting for all along.